everyone. Welcome to A Girl, a Guy, and a Buffy podcast. This is our very first episode, and we're so excited that you're here. My name is Kate Balzer, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
And I'm Charles Flint, and my pronouns are he, him. He, him, his.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us. We are, as we said, a Buffy podcast, and really the focus of this podcast is to delve into and dissect all the wonderful meaty qualities about the show. There's so much to discuss about the show. So this will be a podcast that takes on the entire Buffy the Vampire series and only the television series as of now. We're not looking to the comics or to any of the additional materials that have been written about it. And so that's your spoiler warning. If you haven't watched the entire series and you listen, you might get spoiled about episodes you haven't gotten to yet. But we're really looking at this as a holistic discussion of the entire series. And you want to kind of talk about how we're setting our series up for discussion, Charles?
Yeah, sure. So, like Kate said, we're not doing sort of this episodic episode by episode situation. We are going to be talking about the show as a whole. So again, spoiler alert, we will be spoiling the show left, right, and center. So if you have not watched it, we suggest that you stop this podcast, go back and watch all 7 seasons, and then come back to us. We'll be here for you, I promise. We're not going anywhere. But what we are going to be doing is we're going to be talking about sort of the themes about Buffy and all of these things, and also sort of our how our world has been reflected, how we can reflect our world in Buffy.
This episode is kind of a discuss the show overall, contextualize it, talk about how we came to the show, while we're fans of the show.
So do you remember, Kate, like when you first, like, do you remember sort of some of your first experiences watching Buffy? Like what you felt like? What was that like for you? Do you remember?
Yeah, so I kind of had a crazy introduction. Well, one of the funny things is I wasn't watching much TV at this time because it was my first couple of years of college, and like everything was taken up by activities and classwork. And one of the shows that like I enjoyed and was kind of like my go-to guilty pleasure was there was a show on the WB called Savannah. And it was just like it was an Aaron Spelling soapy show. And I love the fact that it was like filmed in Savannah, Georgia, because I was living in Georgia at the time, and so it was kind of cool. This was before like Atlanta really became the Hollywood of the South it is now. So these were, infrequent happening shows based in Georgia. And then the show was like it ended for the season, and then like back then it was the early days of the internet, so you didn't have like a ton of knowledge about like what was coming next, or is your show coming back, and like nothing. Turns out I learned years later that the show was canceled and the show that replaced it was Buffy. So at first I was like super mad that my show Savannah didn't come back. Ironically, I found like my favorite show ever had been, supplanted it. So how I actually came to watch Buffy was a friend of mine. When we were in college, I was telling her I was going to watch this new show, Dawson's Creek, and she was like, "Oh, I have my sorority meeting that night. Can you record it?" And by the way, I watched the show beforehand called Buffy. Can you record that? Because I'm going to miss it too. And I was like, yeah, no problem. So since we were going to watch Dawson together, I was like, well, I might as well watch Buffy with her. And I kind of had vaguely heard of it. I knew of the movie, but I hadn't seen the movie. So I was like, what the heck? And the first 2 episodes that we watched were Innocence and Surprise. So I was like
Oh, wow.
thrown into like hardcore Buffy sleeps with her boyfriend and he turns evil, and I was like hooked, and I didn't stop watching that show. And then I eventually dropped Dawson's Creek um and was like a Buffy fanatic from there on out.
Oh my goodness. That's so
Yeah.
funny because I came to it via Sarah Michelle Gellar because I was such a huge fan of hers. Like even before Buffy, I was watching
Yeah.
her on Swan's Crossing and All My Children, and I was like obsessed with Sarah Michelle Gellar, like obsessed. And I heard that she was doing the show. I saw like a commercial and I was like, oh my gosh, she's in a new show. And I was so excited that she was doing this. And I was like, what? Buffy the Vampire Slayer? And I remember because I had seen the movie.
Mhm.
And you know, a lot of people don't like the movie. I actually like the movie. I think it's like it's camp, it's a little kitsch or whatever. But there's some cool moments in it. And I remember the show, but I was like, well, like the movie's okay. It's not like great, but it was okay. And I was like, but it's Sarah Michelle Gellar, and I am a ride or die for SMG. Like I will like anything she does, I'm on board. So I sat down and I remember recording it every week because I wasn't always able to watch it because I was like in rehearsals for stuff or doing stuff. And then I would just sit. And then when I was home at my parents' house, I'd like sit on my like on the floor in my bedroom, just like watching watching it over winter break and just loving that show so much and just think it
Yeah.
was like, you know, for me she can do no wrong. And so I freaking love that show. It's so
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. I think one of the things that like pulled me into it too was because I didn't know Sarah. Like I hadn't watched All My Children and I hadn't seen some of her earlier stuff. Buffy was my first introduction to Sarah Michelle Gellar, but didn't know his name, but I knew who Anthony Stewart Head was because he was the hot neighbor in the Taster's Choice commercials.
That is a
And I'm like,
throwback.
I know, right? And he was. You were like, oh my God, this really good looking, like dreamy, kind of like intelligent British guy. And I was like, ooh, he's in this show too. So that was actually like my first kind of hook onto it, in addition to just being like, oh, sure, I'll just watch this like random show with my friend because she watches it. But yeah, so
That's hilarious.
I know.
I forgot about him being
The
in the Taster's
Taster's Choice.
Choice.
How I came to it, that's how you came to it, and we've been hooked ever since. Is there, can you talk about a little bit about the impact, if any, the show has had on your life?
Yeah, well, I mean, so much. I mean, first first and foremost, I think sort of the friendships that I've made based on the show. Just so many people who I've bonded with over watching the show who love it just as much as I do and as we do. And I think that's the community that it has built and the fan base. It's one of the first shows to really like that. I mean, other I would say Star Trek is, you know, probably one of them, but like this idea of like fandom and this
Yeah.
idea of like really having this fan base that builds a community that forms a community. Um, and because it was such, you know, it was in those early days of the internet, where there were message boards and things like that. And it was at a time where you could really engage with each other in that way. And then also, surprisingly, the writers were like like low key just like hiding out in those like in those chat rooms and
Right.
talking to fans and like listening to what the fans had to say. So they were able to sort of respond to what, you know, they were able to get a beat on what was really exciting about that. And so in that way it felt like the show was ours, like as a fan base, like we really got to have it felt like we had sort of some sort of ownership or some sort of like connection to the show that went beyond just showing up every week.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great point. And for myself, I would definitely say community too. Like I said, I mean, that was sort of the person who got me hooked on the show. We were kind of friends, but I think that really like bonded us together because we made it a weekly thing. It was like she was done with her, weekly sorority meeting, so she'd come over and we'd watch, or we'd watch it the next night. And that really, brought us together, and we developed like a real, not that we weren't real friends, but our friendship ended up going beyond Buffy, but
Mhm.
we were brought together through that show. And then I also, for myself, when I moved to a new city, that was about the time I was really getting more into like the internet part of the Buffy fandom. And I kept seeing like all these people meeting up. They'd like figure out, a bunch of them lived in the city and they're like, hey, let's meet up. And they would either like just meet up for fun stuff or they'd meet up to watch episodes together. And I was like, I want to do that. And that's when I discovered literally the website Meetup.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I was like, where I'm living, do they have a group? And there was one. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to take a chance because you never know what these things could be like. You could completely meet the wrong, the set of people that just you don't connect with, or you could find like your best friend ever. And I went to one of their meetups, and it was actually just at a pizza place. It was just kind of getting together and hanging out as a social activity, and befriended a couple people, and we really clicked. And a group of us, we hung out with them again a few times, but there was a group of us that really connected as friends around Buffy and then beyond Buffy. And that really became like my friend group in this new city. And so and I'm still friends with some of those people today, even though we live in different places. That's where social media definitely helps to stay connected. But I wouldn't have met those people otherwise. And they're some of the best people that I know. If it hadn't been for the show and hadn't been for me taking a chance to say, like, I want to be with other Buffy fans. And it turns out we had so much more in common and so many more connections than just the show. And that's why like true friendships were able to develop.
Yeah, I think Buffy, like, I feel like Buffy fans are really kind of, excuse me, are really just awesome people. I think that, the community that it builds, I think it takes, there's sort of, to really sort of embrace the show and really understand the show, there has to be sort of this emotional intelligence and this sensitivity and understanding and empathy that exists in a human being in order to really understand the journey that Buffy goes through. And I think people who really get it, and it's just great. I mean, it really is. I mean, I have people who I introduced. I was like, we are sitting down and we are watching this, and they were like, what? And I was like, y'all don't even know. You don't even know. And they were like, what is this thing? And I was like, yep. See, trust me, I got you.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I also love when you discover somebody you didn't know is a fan. Somehow,
Yes.
like it'll come up in conversation and they're like, oh my God, I love that show. And I'm like, you do too. That's probably also one of my favorite things about the show is it's such a diverse audience of people in every way that you think of diversity. Even though it's a teenage show, you'll certainly have, even back then when it was on, you certainly had people who were way outside their teenage years or their college years, like we were, who were fans of the show and could connect with it. And I think that's why you still have people, coming back to it again and again, or discovering it, years after, even if they may be long past their teenage years, just because there's such a richness and depth of story and characters, that the fact that they start off in high school is only a fraction of the show.
Right. Well, and really high school is one of the few things that is sort of the great equalizer for people. Like I
Yes,
think
yes.
not I won't say everyone because I don't want to generalize, but I think, most people have had a high school experience. And so they know what it's like to kind of go through all of that. So being able to even look back on it, when you're in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, or, your 50s, you still remember those high school years since they were so formative, whether you completed high school or not, like whether you finished or not.
Exactly, which is why, the show could literally have the world ending, because teenagers understood what that's like, because that's what life feels like to them often. Not everyone, again, not to generalize, but often
Okay, so Kate, let me
at that
ask
time.
let me
Okay, sorry,
ask
go
you,
ahead.
in high school, did you have an end of the world moment? Do you remember like having
Ah.
that moment of breakdown and being like, I hate everything and this is awful and the world is ending?
So the only time I really had that, so we moved from the Northeast to Georgia the middle of my freshman year of high school. So I had just started at my Northeastern high school, which I loved. I had those friends for like 4.5 years. I'd been with them like through late elementary school, middle school, and now high school. And here we go moving to Georgia, which was like, I had two images of Georgia, and I will say these are stereotype images. I know the state much better now. It was either I had thought of Gone with the Wind, or I thought of rednecks. So I had absolutely no idea what to expect. And I'd grown up in the Northeast my entire life up until that point. And so we moved down, and a friend of mine wanted me to come back to visit for their winter break. At the time, Georgia didn't do winter break. And so this was like February. So we had only been living in Georgia for like 2.5 months at that point, or even not even, because that would have been like, it would have been 2.5 months if I went up to visit. And my parents said no, because their reasoning, which I don't know if they told me at the time, they certainly told me years later, was that they felt like if I went back, I wouldn't start to acclimate and adjust to being in the new location, which, makes sense to me as an adult. But when I'm 15 and I feel like my whole life has been taken away from me, that is the one time I threw a tantrum and I was like, I hate you. You ruined my life. I like stormed up the stairs, went to my bedroom. I've like never done any. I was not that kind of kid or teenager. Oh my God, I was so unhappy. So unhappy. Of course, it all actually ended up working out because I like, once I adjusted, I was very happy at the new location and then made great friends who I'm still friends with today. So I can't complain anymore. But oh man, those first few months were definitely rough. So that was definitely my end of the world moment.
So it's so funny that we have very similar stories. We have very similar end of the world stories because mine came when I was in Maryland at the time and I was like 15. I had just come out to my parents and my friends and like literally like 2 months later, 2 or 3 months later, my parents were like, we're moving to Georgia. And I was like, and I had sort of the same idea, like the things that I knew about Georgia. I mean, we had lived in Atlanta before, but when I was very, very young.
Yeah.
But and having lived like up north and my perception of Atlanta, of Georgia had sort of changed. I mean, the last movie I saw was Deliverance, and
Yeah.
so I was very, so I was very, very concerned about what it meant to be queer and in Georgia. It's very confusing. Uh, but I just remember,
Hearing banjo music freaked you out.
yeah, it really did. I was like, am I really gay? I don't know if this is what gay means. I'm not really sure. Yeah, it
Uh,
really kind of freaked me out for a minute. So when they told us that we were moving to Georgia, I mean, quintessential line, I literally yelled at them and was like, "You're ruining my life." And I didn't talk to them for like months. I mean, I like the whole time, like from that whole transition, I was very cold to my parents and was just like, I'm keeping to myself. I don't want to do this. Um, I don't want to accept this destiny that
yeah.
has been, put before me, you know, into every generation a queer child must move to the rural south and live his life as a queer youth in Georgia. But again, I think it worked out because I met some amazing people and I've found a family here and I found friends and found a safe space and found my calling and all of those things. And so it really was, it really did all work out for the best. So again, I go back to, us being sort of the original Scoobies. I think we sort of,
Yeah.
had a destiny thrust upon us that we didn't want,
Right.
and embraced it anyway and came out stronger for it, just
For
like
sure.
Buffy. So,
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. Yeah, 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 for sure.
um, and so let's let's talk about how Buffy transformed television. Let's talk about that for a moment because
Yeah.
I mean, I think it did. It was revolutionary for its time, and it did it and continues to change television and influence how television is made. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, for me, one of the things that I recognize too that like we're talking about, it came out in the 90s, so we're talking about it's the era of Scream. We're talking about Spice Girls. YA was really kind of coming um into play here. And there was so much like teen focused property happening. And so I think people started to realize that teens have buying power, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
They were going to the mall, they were shopping, they were spending all this money. They had disposable income.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely started in the 80s, but I think it grew hugely in the 90s when we were coming into middle and high school. It definitely became a bigger deal, and Hollywood and marketing really began to recognize that.
And so you get these stations like the WB that grew out of that, this fledgling network that came out of nowhere, because this was back in the days before there was streaming and before,
Yes.
there was like literally 5 channels.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we definitely were, cable was a much bigger deal.
Sure.
But yeah, there were only at the time 4 major networks, and then you added the WB, and then of course there was PBS, and then cable, but not everyone had cable. Like, it was still the days where you would only have network television stations.
Right.
And there certainly wasn't the focus on youth and youth culture in its own, on its own channel, which not really how the WB started, but that's where it shifted to within a couple of years. And that's where you started with having, shows like Buffy, and then they eventually added Dawson's Creek and Charm. And so it really became not only youth focused, but very young female focused,
Right.
which had never been done before.
Right. And there was a lot of focus on, these shows about teens dealing with their emotions,
Mm-hmm.
and in small towns too. A lot of that stuff wasn't
Yeah.
like in big cities. It wasn't like New York, and I mean, it wasn't Beverly Hills 90210. It
Right.
wasn't that. It was really sort of the antithesis of that.
Yeah. But yeah, agreed. It wasn't a big city story most of the time.
There wasn't anything that sort of existed like that. And so when Buffy came along, you know, it you, it influenced how those stories were told. It influenced showrunners.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Well, and I would safely argue that it was probably one of the first shows to truly break genre barriers. There had
mhm,
been some earlier shows, ones that were certainly popular that went into, a couple of genres. The two popping out the most would be the X-Files and Twin Peaks.
mhm,
But really, when you look at Buffy, I mean, it's teen. It's got elements of soap opera. It's horror. It's a drama. It's a comedy. They were doing that before we came up with the word dramedy.
right.
So it definitely was groundbreaking in that way, not just centered on a female action hero, or a teenage female action hero and some of the storytelling they did, but just the fact that the way they did the storytelling was incredibly groundbreaking as well,
Mhm,
in ways that you probably saw much more. Well, obviously, Joss Whedon is very influenced by comic books. So you saw that a lot more in comic books.
mhm.
And I think you can see that influence in the show, but that hadn't been done in television before. But you may have seen more, like we said, in comic books or even books themselves, but not
Right.
really anything that had been done in the visual medium of television or even movies. I think movies were pretty like, you're in this category, you're in that category.
Mhm.
And nowadays we expect much more multi-layered, multi-genre properties.
And I think I will say that I think one of the few shows that did sort of do some of that, but again, it didn't have all the elements,
Mm-hmm.
was Degrassi,
Gotcha.
which
Okay. That.
was sort of the serialized like teen drama that dealt with a lot of like heavy issues, but it was so based in reality,
Right.
and so Buffy sort of taking that and like subverting it and making this supernatural thing and taking all of the like final girl situation and making her the heroine and doing all of that stuff and taking all of the tropes of high school and flipping it on its head. Um, and just how it was told with, these sort of, with these big bads that we kept coming back to. It wasn't just like, episodic and we defeat the thing this week and then we're coming back and we had to keep coming back to it. And I know that Shonda Rhimes talks about how much it influenced her writing and things like that. And the Vampire Diaries and Supernatural, all of those shows that came out that people were like, each one of those showrunners has said how much Buffy influenced what they did and how they created television.
And then you think about also all the writers on the show, particularly in later seasons, who
Hmm.
themselves have now gone on to write for other shows, create movies, and really well-known, popular ones,
Hmm.
as well. It's
Like Jane Espenson, you're talking,
yeah, Marty Noxon,
Drew
Drew
Goddard.
Goddard,
Yeah.
yeah, Stephen
Just
DeKnight,
just all of the like amazing shows that they have produced and been a part of and writers on. Um, that they contributed to Buffy and they helped make Buffy sort of this wonderful show that we all love, and they have
right.
gone on to share that. So I mean this sort of generation, again, into every generation, amazing writers were born and they gave us great television that we love to binge and that we love to, that we just are obsessed with, and we're just sort of, we're here for it. I
Absolutely. And then I think one of the other big defining elements to Buffy that they really kind of broke the mold on was typically in shows, particularly in the 80s and early 90s, when you dealt with serious issues. I mean, this was a lot more on probably comedies, but there would always be that very special episode. And it was, we're tackling a serious issue like eating disorders or intimate partner violence or drug use. And it was, sort of a one-off episode. And it was like done during sweeps week to get ratings. And Buffy really broke that. There was no very special episode. They were dealing with those issues all along, and
Right.
in more in-depth ways as well. It wasn't most of the time it was not a one-off thing, particularly obviously as it related to the core characters. YZ.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and when you think about all of the things that they did talk about, like this just occurred to me. Like Buffy was one of the first shows to even sort of, when you're looking at sort of modern day or whatever, talking about teens and working with computers, to talk about catfishing.
True.
Like,
Oh my gosh. Well, and as we know, the term Googling came from Buffy.
right.
Like, I'm gonna Google this. That came in, I think it was season 6 or 7 of Buffy. And like nobody said that before then, really, or if they did, it wasn't a part of pop culture.
Right. It wasn't in the lexicon. But like
Right.
when Malcolm comes on,
Yep.
like,
Yep.
and what is that, season one, where they're talking, or season, yeah, season one?
Season
Yeah,
1. Yeah.
yeah. So, and Willow's getting catfished by this thing, like that sort of thing, as being like thinking about like that as a story, as a
Yeah.
storyline. Like it's so crazy to think of all of the sort of things that we're so invested in now, that are so commonplace now, that
Right.
Buffy was kind of one of the first to talk about these issues and was sort of an issue, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you said, that was also the early days of the internet becoming mainstream. Obviously, it had been around for a while, but most people were just kind of coming into it in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we certainly didn't have smartphones back then. And so those concerns that were coming out about the internet, could manifest in storylines like the I Robot You Jane with the demon in the computer, basically, as you said, catfishing Willow. So yeah, those were kind of, of the moment stories that they were able to focus on and that were also relevant to teenagers at that time.
Right. And there's not even a use. I mean, I think even in, like the usage of cell phones like that, I like there's, you know, I think there's a cell phone appears in like episode one with Cordelia, where she says like one of my favorite lines, where she's like, I have to call everyone I have ever met right now. And then, but then I don't think we really see a cell phone again until like season seven, when Dawn gets one for school. Like,
Yeah, no, that's true.
you
And
know,
and part of that was on purpose. I mean, cell phones were starting to become more common,
sure.
not super common, but I do remember reading it in an interview where, like, I think it was Joss Whedon who said that was done on purpose because otherwise it made certain things too easy to do,
Hmm.
because then you could just whip out your cell phone, and
Right.
so they did that on purpose. And nowadays that would look silly. Like, you can't have that as an artificial barrier, be like, other than like a parent being like, I don't want my teen to have a smartphone in a storyline. You could see that. And then in those early days, Buffy had a beeper because obviously she's like, if the
Right.
apocalypse
First
comes,
call.
beat me. But I think that's pretty much the only time the beeper ever was pulled out. It was that
Right.
one episode.
It's just like I'm not having it. I said that,
So
but
we could
also
get that great line.
yeah, and speaking of that, like I think that was the other thing that made it such an influential thing was the language and the lines and the
Yes.
writing of it was so it was so clever and there was a they created this whole new language where teens sounded like teens and it didn't sound like old people writing for teenagers. It sounded
Right.
like, oh, this is how actual people would speak because they created their own language. They created this you know, uh, this vernacular that just fit in. That sounds weird. That fit into the mouths of these actors, but and it just sort of flowed. And I mean, I love quoting Buffy because I mean, I think there's so many great quotable moments from that show.
Well, I know I still find myself, even after all these years, using some of the language that they came up with in my everyday vocabulary. It's not even about like quoting great lines, but saying like Wiggins or of the good or of the bad, just the turn of phrases that are what the show is known for. And I agree that because they created their own language, it felt very authentic, very um, teen like. The irony is it's a 20 something, late 20 something year old man, white man who ended up creating that language. So that, it is kind of funny that it was created by an adult, but it feels so authentic to the teen vernacular.
Hmm. And Cordelia just has some great lines too that just
Yeah.
sort of embody the spirit of that show and of the language. And so they're real. I mean, it really does. And there's so many, and even beyond when we're talking about sort of the impact that Buffy had, when you look at even modern television and things that are happening, how often Buffy gets mentioned in
Yeah.
television shows, and sort of references to Buffy kind of get slid into shows as these little Easter eggs and things like that. That's so amazing that it continue to reverberate as people find it and find a love for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Well, and I love too, it pops up in things that like in places you don't expect.
Hmm. About, I mean, Big Bang Theory is one that like it's such a geeky thing, but they talk about
Yeah.
Buffy all the time. They make references. One of my favorites is the is in The Magicians.
Uh-huh.
There's this great scene. This is sort of maybe a spoiler alert if you have not watched The Magicians or if you're watching The Magicians, maybe pause and skip ahead. There's this great scene between two of the characters. Margot and Elliot are talking, and they're being spied on. The eye, one of her eyes is cursed, and so they can't have a conversation without the fairy queen hearing everything. And so they're trying to have a conversation, so they have to speak in code. And the code that they choose to use is describing scenes from like popular like TV shows and things like that, so that
Uh-huh.
they have a context. And one of the things that Elliot said, he's like, best episode of he says he makes a comment and he's like best episode of Buffy ever. And she goes, once more. And like the translation is like once more with feeling. He was like, no, the other one. He was like, we have to, he says, we have to best episode of Buffy ever. And she goes, huh? She goes, once more with feeling. He goes, no, the other one. And like the translation is hush. And so
Oh,
telling her
yeah.
that we have to be quiet. And
Yeah.
that's what he chooses to use. So I think it's clever how it gets thrown out and used. Um, I love that
Yeah,
clip.
for
It was
sure.
so.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it really was it was so defining in the moment and continues to be nowadays, even as we're 25 years on and we're reassessing, properties from the past 25, 30, 35, 40 years. With different perspectives today, I still think there's so much of value in that show, even as there's valid space for criticism of it as well.
I think that there's a lot of criticism that can be had towards the characters in Buffy. The one thing I will say, and that I credit to the writers of the show, is that I think when people criticize people about when we're looking at it through sort of a today's lens about, well, this character didn't do this or this character didn't do that. The show was written in a specific time and place, and also I think a lot of those characters were written that way on purpose. They were written because they needed to be this way in order to tell the story. So it wasn't about necessarily being always, sometimes maybe it wasn't always being about unconscious about certain things and certain stories. I think there are some moments that definitely were. But I think like some characters were written because they needed to be written that way so that we could explain and show, like, this is why we don't treat women this way, and this is why Buffy stands out, because, you know, she's surrounded by all these jerky guys and like guys who want to do, you know, all of this stuff. So I think that there's a little bit of that that goes along with it. So I mean, I want to stand up for it, but I also realize that there are some issues with the show for sure.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, I think it's just more people are stating it and looking at it from today as the show has grown in popularity and it's available to stream and more people are discovering it. But I will say, having been, you know, parts of discussions either with people in real life or on the internet, a lot of these criticisms were coming up then. And also not just in those places, but, you know, I don't know if it's still true today, but certainly back when the show was on and not long after it had ended, I believe it was the most academically studied television show. And so, you know, there were academics that were doing analysis and bringing up some of these same criticisms as well. So that's always been there for sure. I think we're just seeing it at a larger pop cultural level. Yeah. Well, and obviously, I mean, I think the biggest valid criticism you can lob at the show, which it was of its time, it was not the only one, is a lack of diversity in the characters, but behind the scenes.
Sure.
Certainly speaking to the showrunner and the writers, I'm going to assume, like most shows, you could probably speak to the rest of the behind the scenes roles as well, is probably not a large diversity, which we'll delve into what that all means, you know, I think at a later date, but recognizing it as we sort of do a time and a place discussion of the show right now.
Yeah, and just sort of giving context of how the show impacted, you know, the impact that it had in the moment and its impact now. So that's just what we're talking about, and sort of fanning out a little bit about all of those things.
Nice.
So yeah, I mean, and again, I think the fans are they just connect with the material in such a powerful way, and I think they see themselves in it. And I've heard people say how it saved their lives, how it changed their lives. And I don't know, you know, and maybe because I'm a part of the fandom, you know, I don't hear a lot of other people saying that about a lot of other shows. I'm sure there are other shows out there that have had that same sort of impact. But I feel like this one just has such a strong resonance with people and its fans.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely one of the things you'll hear the most about it from fans of the show for sure.
Excellent.
So, as part of contextualizing the show, you know, looking at it with today's eyes, obviously the revelations and allegations that have come out about the show's creator, like so many shows, you know, play into that and are part of reviewing the show and reading it in a new way. And that's just something we also have to consider when discussing the show and when going back and, you know, taking a look at it and rewatching it. And, you know, for some people, it may impact how they view it. For some people, it won't. You know, for some people, they might never be able to watch it again because they can't separate, you know, the information and the stories and the allegations that have come out against Joss Whedon as the creator. And, you know, to say all of that, all of those takes on it and all of those reactions to it are obviously completely valid. It's a complicated question when you have an artist who is a complicated person and, information comes out about them that changes your perspective on them, particularly in the negative for negative behavior. And I don't think there's no easy answer. I don't even think. I know there's no easier. It's a complicated question. And I'm sure at some point that will come up in our discussions, particularly this season, focusing on feminism and gender. But we wanted to say that we're not ignoring that. We recognize that's part of Buffy's story now as well.
Yes, and as part of that, and wanting to acknowledge that and to be supportive of everyone who's come out and spoken out, we also want to take a moment to sort of uplift all of the people who were a part of the show, because the show, like we've been talking about, the show kind of goes beyond its creator. It's about all of the producers and all of the writers, the actresses. Buffy is Sarah Michelle Gellar, and Buffy, and Sarah Michelle has said herself that she is grateful for the role of Buffy. She loved playing Buffy, and that she loves that she will always be connected to Buffy. That being said, there's so much more that we can uplift and celebrate about the show, and especially about the women who worked on that show, and their impact that they had despite the awful conditions that they had to work under and the things that they had to endure. And I think that just goes to the testament of the power of that women have, and the resilience that women have.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you all so much for joining us this week.
Yes, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. We definitely want to hear your thoughts. If you want to send us an email with your thoughts, questions, concerns, you can email us at abuffypodcast@gmail.com.
We're on Facebook and Instagram at A Buffy Podcast. And if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe and download our podcast. We would thoroughly love it. And make sure to leave us a review, and send us some stars and some love.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.